Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, you can stay up to date with new episodes by hitting the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts if you haven't done so already. You can also find a full archive of previous episodes at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. Most African countries have fared relatively well in their responses to the coronavirus pandemic, reporting rates of infection and mortality that are far below those seen across much of Europe and the Americas. Yet Africa is expected to take a huge economic hit from the pandemic and its associated containment measures, with the African Development Bank forecasting that an additional 50 million people could be pushed into extreme poverty across the continent. Governments, multilateral organizations, and aid donors are, of course, doing their best to contain the damage, but what can be done to prevent such a calamity from recurring in the future, or at least to soften the blow? Efosa Ojomo is the head of the Global Prosperity Research Group at the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation. He's a co-author of The Prosperity Paradox: How Innovation Can Lift Nations Out of Poverty. He has argued that while vaccines and economic relief packages are certainly important to respond to the pandemic, long-term recovery efforts should ultimately aim to build societies that are more resilient to economic shocks. That means fostering what he calls market-creating innovations, broad-based solutions to poverty and other social problems. He's joining me now from Boston. Efosa, welcome to Trendlines.
Thanks a lot, Elliot. It's really good to be here with you.
I'd like to start in a way that is admittedly pretty unoriginal, because you probably get the same first question in every interview that you do, and that concerns the definition of what you and your co-authors call a market-creating innovation. What exactly do you mean by that, briefly? And if you don't mind, maybe also give an example or two to illustrate the concept.
Yeah, absolutely. I think definitions are very important. And a market creating innovation is very specific in what it is and what it does. It is an innovation that transforms a complicated and expensive product into a product that's simple and affordable, so many, many more people in society can get access to it. Now, these innovations, by design, have three outputs. The first is that they lead to the creation of new jobs because the innovator is developing a product that's serving the vast majority of people who historically could not access that product. So they need more people to make the product, market the product, sell the product, service the product, and so on. The second output are profits and taxes. You see, for any society to develop, it ultimately needs to build good institutions, infrastructure, and so on. A market-creating innovation provides the profits that can then be taxed and to support the government's efforts in building a better society. And the third output is something a bit more ambiguous and nebulous, so hard to quantify. It leads to this cultural change in society where innovations and entrepreneurship become more valued. And so I'll give you a great example of this. If you look at the proliferation of mobile phones across the world in the past 20 some odd years, and look at how it's spread in emerging economies. Let's focus on, say, Africa, for instance. Late 1990s, 5% maybe of the population had access to phones, majority in South Africa. And then this new technology comes around, and innovators figured out a business model to make it simple, affordable to millions of Africans. Fast forward to today, you're looking at penetration of upwards of 70-80%. That industry supports directly and indirectly about 3 million jobs, generates billions of dollars in taxes, about 15 or so billion annually, and is estimated to be worth about $150 billion. You look at the GDP of Africa, you're talking about $2.5 to $3 trillion, although COVID has certainly affected that. And that's one industry, right? Just, the ability for people to make phone calls. But also think about the fact that there are now over 100 mobile telecommunications companies across the continent taking part in this market, growing this market. And so that's perhaps one of the most tangible examples of market creating innovations. If we go back, say, 100 years and look at the democratization of cars in wealthier countries, we start with the US, it's what Henry Ford did. Cars back then were like private jets, very wealthy people had access to them, and most people moved around either by train or if you had a horse and carriage or something. But Ford figured out a way to democratize cars. And in doing so, this led to significant development. Even things like attendance in schools increased because transportation costs were reduced. Distribution and logistics business, farming became more productive. Healthcare became more available and accessible just because he was able to create this new market, democratize access, not to mention all the jobs and attendant benefits. And so, at the core of development, we see this need to invest in and foster market creating innovation ecosystems.
You've argued that these kinds of innovations are a much more effective path to long term prosperity than the traditional ways of addressing poverty that we often think about. How so?
Yeah, so it's quite counterintuitive. I'll tell a quick story. I got into the what I would call maybe the poverty business about 12, 13 years ago. And I got in, I would say like the majority of people in the development space, bleeding heart. I go into a poor community, no access to water, and it breaks my heart. And so I get back to where I am. I get some friends together. I say, we got to fix this. Let's raise money and build wells. Well, we did that, but that's where the problem started. The wells broke after a few months, and then I found myself in a situation where I got to keep figuring out how to fix the wells in disparate communities, about five different communities where we did some work in. After five wells and five broken wells, we decided, we can't keep raising money, building wells, knowing that they're going to break. That right there is a represents it's a microcosm of the bigger development industry. And so organizations may not be building wells. It might actually be institutional reform. It might be schools. It might be health clinics. Lots of ventilators were donated to many African countries. Many of them probably were never used because, again, the supporting infrastructure did not exist. But the idea of seeing a need, seeing that a community lacks a resource, and then leaning in with the best of intentions to provide that resource without the the fundamental mechanism that will sustain that resource is, I think, one of the most problematic things in the way we do development. The market creating innovation approach is entirely different. It comes in with questions, not answers. It comes in to solve a specific need that may or may not relate to what I think the biggest need is in the community, right? It comes in to solve a specific need. But in doing that, it makes sure the ecosystem, the mechanism that supports the sustainability of that need is there. And really, that mechanism is a market. Now, a market is not going to solve all the problems in the world. And I often tell people, there are many challenges we have in the world today, and not everything should be done for profit, but everything that needs doing requires profit. And so sometimes my message gets misconstrued in that, oh, it's the private sector that's going to fix everything, it's the market. Well, that's not entirely true. We have to think about this as a journey or a spectrum. The market has benefits that it provides, these jobs I'm talking about, these profits that can fund other things in society. And let's leverage that so that we can build a more just and equitable society. And so I think that's really how, this approach differs from the conventional approach that goes in and tries to fix or provide the lack of resources. There are no schools. Okay, let me build schools. There's no water. Let me build wells. There's no hospitals. Let me build that, without understanding the mechanism that will sustain those resources.
It makes sense. It makes a lot of sense to me because what you're talking about also sustains the tax revenue and public services that then allow entrepreneurs to thrive. But I want to also ask you because you've described a kind of like virtuous cycle, right? That begins with innovation, leads to the growth of new markets and jobs, and that creates that higher tax revenue and more money for infrastructure and public services. And then that fosters an environment that's conducive to further innovation. And then that comes kind of full circle in a way. That's sort of a crude, oversimplified, probably description. But that model would seem to presume a governance context that might not reflect reality, not just in Africa, but in other emerging markets as well. So, how does your model account for things like corruption and rent seeking behavior getting in the way of innovation?
In our book, The Prosperity Paradox, we dedicate a chapter to corruption. And, we have an interesting title for the chapter. Corruption is not the problem, it's a solution. Now, what we mean by that is we treat corruption like a cancer. And in order to try to solve it or fix it, and under corruption, I would say rent-seeking behavior, anything that really reduces the efficiency of governance and government bureaucracy. We try to understand why it happens. And then we categorize corruption differently. No one wakes up with this need to simply just be corrupt for corruption's sake. You wake up and you are corrupt because it affords you certain benefits. And so we try to understand why is overt corruption more prevalent in this society versus this other one? Is there something in the water, or is it the circumstances in which people find themselves? In order to do that, well, we have to go back and we say, well, how was the United States 100 years ago, 150 years ago with regards to corruption? Was it the way it is today? Or was it more similar to many emerging economies? Well, it turns out as you probably guess, it was more similar to many emerging economies. You wanted to build a road or bridge back then, you got a dime worth of roads for every dollar you spent. But here's the key: it evolved. How and why did it evolve? Well, it was this dynamic evolutionary process of new markets coming into the scene, people getting jobs, and there was this thing specifically in the U.S. Good governance clubs began to rise, and they began to actually demand more justice, more transparency, more efficiency in governance. And so, if we think of the world as it exists, it's often in a state of entropy, right? It's disorder and chaos. And it takes a lot of work and effort to actually bring things together in an ordered way. And so, the notion that somehow a poor country government should act like a rich country government when, number one, the amount of revenues they have is orders of magnitude less than what the rich country government has. So you look at Nigeria, for instance, federal government spends roughly $200 per year per citizen. And that's for everything: infrastructure, salaries, schools, healthcare, paying back debt. $50 to $60 of that goes to pay back debt. The United States spends roughly $20,000 per citizen per year. You go to Norway, Denmark, they're talking $30,000. And so when you read the indices, the corruption perception index, the doing business index, and so on, and they show these countries at the top and many low income countries at the bottom, well, it's missing a critical ingredient. How much resources do these countries have to solve and fix these problems? Oh, and by the way, when rich countries were poor, they also struggled immensely. And so this mechanism is absolutely key. This market creating innovation mechanism. Now, it's not easy. I want to make that clear. It's not easy navigating an environment where the government is designed to infuriate and frustrate you, especially when you're trying to build a business that's successful. However, I have not, in my research, found a better way. And over the last 6 to 7 decades, since the beginning of the development industry, we have had a model that says, let's go in and let's provide these resources. Let's help these governments change. Let's build this infrastructure. Let's do this. And how's that working today? It's really not. And so I think we need to shift the paradigm, connect it to what really worked, uh, um, with the understanding that it's going to be a difficult, evolutionary, and dynamic journey to prosperity.
So, as countries in Africa begin the long slog of recovering from the pandemic, are there any budding entrepreneurs or untapped markets that you see as having particularly good potential for this kind of growth cycle that you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are too many. In regions like Africa, you go to India, Bangladesh. There are too many, and they're too obvious. You look at healthcare, right? I mean, you look at education. I mean, food. Yeah, food production. We don't even have to go high tech. So if you think of healthcare, for instance. The healthcare system in many wealthier countries are, much better than poor countries, but they require a ton of resources. You got to build a 200-bed hospital, different specialties. And you think about the infrastructure required to just maintain that, medical schools and different specialties, and enough money so that the physicians don't, or healthcare workers don't emigrate to another country and so on. It's a ton. We need a new paradigm. And so a company called M Pharma, based in Ghana, is really trying to make drugs more affordable. Now it's starting on making sure pharmacies have access to the drugs they need. It provides financing for some of these pharmacies. It helps manage their supply chain so they're never out of stock. But it's leveraging technology to make this product, pharmaceuticals, available. My guess is that company is going to keep integrating backwards and will someday start manufacturing some of these drugs, perhaps start with generics, and then we'll start doing R&D. The thing is, it is a process. This thing is a journey, development, right? Where you start is not necessarily where you end. And so that's an example of a company that's trying to tackle the healthcare problem from that angle. You look at education. You're in New York, I'm in Boston. We could shelter in place and internet at home, and kids could still learn. Well, that's that's not possible in many emerging economies. And so there's a company called ULesson. It's based in West Africa, Nigeria, but serving West African markets. And it's trying to digitize a lot of the learning that happens in the classroom, especially, and this is key for kids and families that do not have internet access. It's a tall order. It's an incredible amount of work that they're doing. But imagine if they're able to pull this off. You get an inexpensive device. It's got all your stuff on there. And then we get another pandemic in a year or two. Well, it's not the same quality as being in front of a teacher and maybe getting that one-on-one learning, but it's leaps and bounds above what is currently happening. Those are two small examples of ed and healthcare. And I'll end with one we wrote about in the Prosperity Paradox. Microinsure, it's an insurance company making insurance affordable for people who earn less than $3-4 a day. And you might, how's that possible? That's impossible. I don't even understand my insurance products. But this guy, Richard Lefley, has figured out a business model that actually makes the provision of insurance to over, I think, 65, 70 million people now across several emerging economies profitable. I think, and I'll sort of land the plane here. One of the struggles with the model we propose, this notion of innovation solving many of these challenges, is that we don't know the answer to these many of these challenges. Elliot, I can't sit here and tell you I know how to solve many of these problems. That would be a lie. But when you go into a community and you see it does not have water, it does not have a school, the idea that the answer to that problem is I'm going to build a well, I'm going to build a school, that is often met with applause. Nobody ever gets fired for building a well or suggesting to build a well, right? Because in our minds, we attach those solutions to those problems, even though many of them don't work, many of them are not sustainable. Um, but to go into a community or a country with the humility to immerse yourself in the problem and say, what technologies do we have available? What business models do we have? Can we try? They may fail, but what can we do in order um, to make these products and services more accessible to people? That's what's required. A lot of humility and learning.
What I think is really appealing about what you're describing is that the solutions are always tailored and adapted to the actual lived experiences and circumstances of the people who will be using them. And it sort of harkens back to that example you gave of the car companies and how companies like Toyota and Kia in Japan and South Korea built cars that were actually designed for the kinds of road conditions and the kinds of economic circumstances that their customers were in.
That's right. That's right. Now, if the government decides to play ball, it's a lot easier. I mean, if we look at a Singapore, for instance, you had a Lee Kuan Yew who came in and really said, let's try to get corruption out. Let's try to build a national sort of come under this umbrella of unity and so on. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but I tell people that's like winning the governance lottery, right? Just because your neighbor wins the lottery and is now doing really well, you don't go and raise your kids up to say, hey, you got to go figure out how to win the lottery too. Most countries start out with very bad governance, including the United States, including the UK and many other countries. Most start out with bad governance, and so the question we have to ask is not, do these good inclusive institutions lead to economic growth? But it's how do I, in the context in which I find myself, go from bad institutions, bad governance to good institutions and good governance? And that is a very context specific question. That is not like a how do I go from institutions in emerging economies to institutions in wealthier economies. That's not that question. That is how do I go from institutions that are delaying progress, stymieing growth, to institutions that will expedite growth and prosperity in my context. And it may look like an institution in the U.S. It may not. It's critical that we appreciate that.
In one of your research papers, you mentioned that in many cases there are already these existing, what you call workarounds to some of the problems that can be addressed through innovation. The example you gave of Osusu, for example, a kind of community-based microfinance that's practiced in parts of Africa, and there are variants in other parts of the world too. Could you talk a little bit more about how these kinds of pre-existing indigenous practices can form the base for large-scale innovation?
Absolutely. So I think one of the things that could really scale in innovation or the impact of it, because I would call Osusu an innovation. It just doesn't have a technology enabler or an enabling technology, if you will. One of the things that could scale that is this technology. And so going into a community and seeing how people already have solved a problem, because in order to solve a problem, especially a collective problem like this one, an asusu is where people come, different people, maybe in a market, put money together, and perhaps 12 people, right, put money together, and every month the money goes to one person. So it's a form of saving. It's a form of managing your cash flows. Not perfect, but it's a form. Well, that requires trust, right? And so how do we take that model where there's already trust, which is critical, and professor out of Harvard Business School, Tarun Khanna, wrote his most recent book is on trust. And so I'd recommend your readers to check that out. How do we take a system like that and then jumpstart it or scale it with technology? Right. And we're seeing many of those things happen now. Now, there's a big sort of crowdfunding, agriculture, agri-tech ecosystem developing where you have companies like Farm Crowdy, Thrive Greek, giving Elliot, you could go on their website, invest in a farm, a cocoa farm, a rice farm in somewhere in Africa. Many are in West Africa, and they will promise as much as investors can promise a return. So you invest in this farm, whether it's rice, you get 22% return in 6 months or something, right? And so that's a way technology can embed itself into a society and then scale the innovations that people have come up with. And I think it's by going in, with humility as a major ingredient, learning how people work and live, and then leveraging technologies where possible to help people scale these innovations. And I think there's a lot of opportunity. I mean, my goal for your listeners would be the next time you hear about a problem in fill in the blank country, flip it on its head and say, okay, X million number of people don't have access to Y, right? How might that be an opportunity? Because if I solve that problem, there's going to be a huge market. It's going to be lots of taxes, lots of jobs, lots of prosperity. That's a big if, and I'm not saying the solution is easy, but I think if you begin to reframe these issues from that context, I think we can get to the end of poverty in our lifetime. I really do believe it.
Efosa, thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely, Elliot. Thanks so much for having me. It's been great to talk to you about these ideas, and I really hope it inspires your listeners to think differently about the problem of poverty, prosperity, and the critical role innovation plays. Thanks again.
Efosa Ojomo is the head of the Global Prosperity Research Group at the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation. He's a co-author of The Prosperity Paradox: How Innovation Can Lift Nations Out of Poverty. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you'd like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm @Elliot Waldman with 2 L's and 1 T. And Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.